family is supposed to be the safest place in the world. The people who take you in, who feed you, tell you that you finally belong, are supposed to stand between you and harm, not walk you toward it. The leader becomes a father. Followers become brothers and sisters. The group becomes the family you always wished you had. That is the promise. That is what pulls people in. But for the people in these cases, the family they were given was the very thing that ended them. They drank it willingly in a clearing in the jungle. They lay down in matching shoes beneath a comet. They were sealed inside a burning church. They carried it onto a crowded morning train. One family followed a dead man's voice until all 11 of them were gone. The belonging they were offered, and the moment it turned fatal, are what bind them together. Today we are covering 10 families that ended in mass death, and the men who convinced them that dying together was the same thing as being saved. Case 1, the Manson family. It was just past midnight on Saturday, August 9, 1969, in the hills above Los Angeles, on a quiet, dead-end road called Cielo Drive in Benedict Canyon, kind of address that people worked their whole lives to reach, a long private driveway. An electric gate, sprawling ranch-style house set back among the trees, with a swimming pool and a view of the lights of the city spread out below. Inside the house at 1050 Cielo Drive, a 26-year-old actress named Sharon Tate was spending the evening with 3 friends. She was 8.5 months pregnant with a baby boy. Her husband, the film director Roman Polanski, was in London working on a project and was due home within the week. They had already chosen a name for their son. By the time the sun came up over Los Angeles that morning, Sharon Tate, the child she was carrying, and 4 other people would no longer be alive. The city of Los Angeles would begin one of the strangest and most frightening murder investigations in its history. Sharon Tate had grown up the daughter of an army officer, moving from base to base as a child, and had become a working actress in Hollywood by her early 20s. She was, by every account, from the people who knew her, gentle, warm, and almost incapable of unkindness. She had married Roman Polanski in 1968. The house on Cielo Drive was the home they had rented to start their family in. That summer, with her husband away, Sharon had asked a few friends to stay with her so she would not be alone in the final weeks of her pregnancy. One of them was Jay Sebring, a 35-year-old celebrity hairstylist, who had once been engaged to Sharon and who had remained one of her closest friends. Another was Abigail Folger, the 25-year-old heiress to the Folger coffee fortune, Harvard-educated young woman who spent her time doing volunteer social work in the city. The third was Folger's partner, Wojciech Frykowski, a 32-year-old writer and friend of Polanski's from Poland. The 4 of them had spent an ordinary summer evening together. They had eaten dinner out, they had come home. The house was quiet. What none of them knew was that the property had been chosen not for the people inside it, but for what it represented. The man who had chosen it was a 34-year-old career criminal named Charles Mills Manson. He had spent more than half of his life in institutions of one kind or another, in and out of correctional facilities since he was a boy, convicted over the years of car theft, fraud, and other crimes. By the time he was released in 1967, he was in his early 30s and had no home, no money, and no plan beyond a strange and growing belief in his own importance. He drifted into San Francisco during the summer that the city was filling up with young people looking for something to believe in. And Manson, small man, who had taught himself to play the guitar in prison and to talk in the looping, hypnotic language of the era, discovered that he had a gift. He could make lost young people feel found. They began to gather around him. Most of them were young women, runaways, drifters, students who had walked away from ordinary, middle-class homes. He told them he loved them. He told them that the rules of the outside world were lies, that family and ownership and shame were all cages, Faust, and that if they gave themselves to him completely, they would finally be free. They called themselves the family. By 1968, they had settled at a rundown old movie set called Spahn Ranch on the edge of Los Angeles, where Western films had once been shot. They lived there together in a kind of permanent commune, pooling everything they had, taking the drugs Manson handed out, listening for hours to him talk. What Manson talked about more and more was the end of the world. He had become fixated on the Beatles' White Album, released in late 1968, and had convinced himself that the band was sending him coded messages. He believed a great race war was coming to America. War, he called Helter Skelter, after one of the songs. He told the family that black Americans would rise up and destroy the white establishment, and that the family would survive by hiding in a bottomless pit in the desert, and would emerge afterward to rule what was left. It was a delusion with no basis in anything real. But the people around him had given him their minds, and when a person has given away their mind, contents of someone else's becomes the only truth they have left. By the summer of 1969, the world had not ended on Manson's schedule. He had grown impatient. He decided, according to the testimony that would later be given by members of the family themselves, that if the war would not start on its own, he would start it. The plan was to commit a series of murders so shocking that the city would tear itself apart looking for whoever had done it, and that the blame would fall on the black community, and that the war Manson had promised would finally begin. There had already been a death that summer. In late July, a family associate named Bobby Biozalale, with help from other members, taken the life of a music teacher named Gary Hinman during a dispute over money, and had written a phrase on the wall in blood to make it look like the work of a militant group. Biozalale had been arrested in early August. The arrest of one of his own seems to have pushed Manson toward the larger plan he'd been building toward all along. On the night of August 8, going into the early hours of August 9, Manson sent 4 members of the family to the house on Cielo Drive. He had once visited the property when a different tenant lived there, and he chose it for that reason. He did not go himself. He sent a 23-year-old follower named Charles Tex Watson, who had become his most trusted lieutenant, along with 3 young women, Susan Atkins, who was 21, Patricia Krenwinkel, who was 21, and Linda Kasabian, 20, and who had joined the family only weeks earlier. Watson told them, in words he attributed to Manson, they were going to that house to destroy everyone in it. They arrived just past midnight. As they came up the driveway, they encountered an 18-year-old named Stephen Parent, who had no connection to anyone famous at all. He had been visiting the property's caretaker, who lived in a separate guest house at the back, and he was leaving in his car. He was the first person to lose his life that night. He was 18 years old. The 4 intruders then entered the main house. Host. What happened over the next half hour was an act of violence so extreme that the investigators who arrived the following morning struggled to describe it. Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger and Wojciech Frykowski were all attacked. Some of them tried to run. Some of them tried to reason with the people who had come into the house. None of them survived. Sharon Tate, in the last minutes of her life, said to have begged for the life of her unborn child. Her plea was not granted. Before they left, one of the killers used Sharon Tate's blood to write the word PG on the front door of the house. 4 of them drove back to Spahn Ranch in the dark. The following night, Manson decided the work was not finished and that the previous night had been too chaotic. This time he went along. he directed the group to a home on Waverly Drive in the Los Feliz neighborhood, where a successful supermarket executive named Leno LaBianca, 44, lived with his wife Rosemary, who was 38. The couple had no connection to Sharon Tate, no connection to Manson, and no connection to anything. They had been chosen, like the house the night before, almost at random. Manson and another member went inside first and tied the couple up. Then Manson left and ordered Watson, Krenwinkel, and a third young follower he had brought along, 19-year-old of Leslie Van Houten, to finish what he had started. Leno and Rosemary LaBianca did not survive the night. On the walls and the refrigerator of their home, the killers again left words written in blood, including the misspelled phrase that had become the center of Manson's entire delusion: helter skelter. For weeks, the Los Angeles Police Department did not connect the two sets of killings. The Tate murders and the LaBianca murders were investigated by different teams, working different theories, and the idea that a group of young people from a desert commune had carried them out as part of a plan to start a race. As war was so far outside anything in ordinary police experience that no one came near it. The break, when it came, did not come from forensic evidence. It came from the killers themselves. Susan Atkins had been arrested on an unrelated matter and was being held in custody. While she was there, she began to talk. She bragged to other women in the jail about what the family had done. She described the night on Cielo Drive in detail. One of the women she confided in went to the authorities. That was the thread investigators pulled. Once they pulled it, the entire structure came apart. Within weeks, Manson and the members of the family who had taken part were in custody. The trial began in 1970 and ran for the better part of a year, making it one of the longest and most expensive trials in California history up to point. The prosecutor, a deputy district attorney named Vincent Bugliosi, faced a problem that had almost no precedent. Charles Manson had not personally taken a single life on Cielo Drive, and on Waverly Drive he had left before the killing began. He had only ever spoken. Bugliosi's task was to prove that the words themselves were the weapon, that Manson had so completely taken over the minds of his followers that his instructions were as good as his own hands. He built the case around the helter-skelter theory, around the testimony of family members who had turned against Manson, and most of all around Linda Kasabian, the young woman who had been present on both nights as a lookout, but who had not taken part in the killing, and who was granted immunity in exchange for telling the court everything she had seen. The behaviour of Manson and his co-defendants during the trial was its own kind of spectacle. Manson appeared one day with an X carved into his forehead, a mark he later turned into a swastika, and the women, followers who were not on trial, gathered on the sidewalk outside the courthouse and carved the same mark into their own foreheads in imitation of him. The young women who were on trial, Atkins, Krenwinkel and Van Houten, laughed during testimony, sang songs, and remained loyal to Manson even as they were being tried for their lives. To the public watching at home, this was perhaps the most frightening part of the entire case. They were young women from ordinary families, and they had been so thoroughly taken over that they could sit in a courtroom, listen to descriptions of what they had done, feel nothing but devotion to the man who had sent them. In early 1971, Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten were convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Tex Watson, extradition from Texas had delayed his case, was convicted separately a short time later. All of them were sentenced to death. The sentence, when it was handed down, felt like the end of the story. It was not. In 1972, the California Supreme Court struck down the state's death penalty as it then existed, and every death sentence in California, including those of Manson and his followers, was automatically commuted to life in prison with the possibility of parole. The most notorious killers in the state were now serving life sentences that would, in theory, allow them to ask for their freedom again and again for the rest of their lives. That is exactly what happened. Over the decades that followed, members of the family came up for parole over and over. Charles Manson was denied parole 12 times. He never expressed genuine remorse, and at various hearings he alternated between denying his role and boasting about his power over others. He spent nearly half a century behind bars, and he died of natural causes on November 19, 2017, in a hospital near Corcoran State Prison at the age of 83. Susan Atkins bragged in the jail cell that broke the case, was denied parole 18 times, and died in custody of cancer in 2009. Tex Watson became a minister in prison and remains incarcerated to this day. Patricia Krenwinkel, after the release of others, became the longest incarcerated woman in the California prison system. She was recommended for parole in 2025, but the recommendation was rejected by the governor. Leslie Van Houten, who had been the youngest, 19 years old on the night she was brought to the La Bianca house, served 53 years before a state appeals court ordered her release in 2023. She was discharged from parole entirely in the summer of 2025. She is the only one of the Tate LaBianca killers to walk free. What the Manson family left behind was not only the people who lost their lives on those 2 August nights, it was a permanent change in how an entire country understood safety. Before Cielo Drive, the danger in the American imagination came from outside, from the stranger in the dark, from the criminal who wanted your money. After Cielo Drive, the country had to absorb something stranger and harder. The idea that the danger could come from a smiling group of young people who believed they were doing something beautiful. Sharon Tate's mother, Doris Tate, spent the rest of her life fighting against the parole of the people who had taken her daughter and grandson, and in doing so became one of the founders of the victims' rights movement in California. A movement that changed the law in ways that still stand. The house on Cielo Drive was eventually torn down, and the address itself was changed. Because too many people kept coming to look. Sharon Tate was 26 years old. Her son was never born. She would have been in her 80s now. The man who sent 4 young people to her door never lifted a hand against her, and went to his grave insisting to anyone who would listen that he had only ever spoken words. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Charles Manson spent years claiming he had only used words, and that others chose their own actions. The next man on this list took that idea far beyond anything Manson achieved, persuading more than 900 followers to die in a mass murder-suicide at a jungle settlement in South America. 300 of the victims were children, many poisoned by their own parents. Case 2, Jonestown. It was the morning of Saturday, November 18, 1978. In a clearing that had been carved out of the dense jungle of northwestern Guyana, several hours by boat and small plane from anywhere most people had ever heard of. The settlement was called Jonestown. It had been built almost entirely by hand by the people who lived in it, more than 900 American citizens who had crossed an ocean to get there. There were rows of simple cabins, a central pavilion with a tin roof, fields of cassava and other crops, a school, a medical building. On that particular morning, the place looked, to the outside visitors who had arrived the day before, almost like the thing it had been sold as. The camp band group the residents called the Jonestown Express played music for a cheerful crowd. People danced, Children were brought out to meet the guests, United States congressmen, who had flown in to investigate the place. Was beginning to think, by the morning of the 18th, perhaps the worst stories he had heard were not true. By the time the sun went down over that same clearing, congressmen would be dead on a jungle airstrip. And more than 900 of the people who had built the settlement with their own hands, including more than 300 children, would no longer be alive. It remains the largest single loss of American civilian life, in a deliberate act until the morning of September 11, 2001. The man who built Jonestown was named James Warren Jones, known to everyone as Jim. He had been born in 1931 in a small town in Indiana into poverty, and he had grown up an intense and unusual child, fixated from a young age on religion and on death. As a young man, he became a preacher. What set him apart in those early years was that his message was, on its surface, a genuinely good one. This was the 1950s in the American Midwest, in the era of legal racial segregation, and Jim Jones preached racial integration with a passion that almost no white pastor of his time would touch. He built a congregation in Indianapolis that welcomed black and white members together. He and his wife adopted children of different races and called their household a rainbow family. He set up soup kitchens. He helped people find housing and jobs. To the people who first came to him, he was not a monster. He was the rare white man who seemed to actually mean what the country only claimed to believe. He called his church the People's Temple. In the mid-1960s, fearing nuclear war and seeking a fresh start, Jones moved the temple to Northern California, and from there to San Francisco. As it grew, it became a real force. At its height, the People's Temple had thousands of members and real political influence in the city. Jones was appointed to a city housing position. Politicians sought his endorsement because he could deliver crowds of disciplined, organised volunteers at a moment's notice. From the outside, he looked like a successful, progressive religious leader, doing the work that everyone else only talked about. Inside, the temple had become something else. The closer a member got to the centre, the more of themselves they were required to give up. Members signed over their money, their property, their paychecks, sometimes the custody of their children. They were encouraged to inform on one another. They were subjected to public humiliations and beatings as discipline. Jones, who had begun using large amounts of drugs and whose mental state was deteriorating, grew obsessed with the idea that enemies were closing in. The government, the media and traitors within his own ranks were all conspiring to destroy him and the temple. And he introduced a practice that would later sound like a warning no one understood at the time. In the middle of the night, he would call the entire community together and tell them that the end had come, that they were all going to die, and he would have them rehearse it. He called these drills White Nights. The people would line up, and they would be told to drink something, and they would be told it was poison, and they would drink it, and then Jones would tell them it had been a test of their loyalty. He was teaching them, over and over, how to die on his command. By the time the real night came, they had practiced it many times. As scrutiny of the temple grew in the United States, former members and worried relatives going to the press with stories of abuse, Jones moved his entire operation out of the country. In the mid-1970s, the temple had leased a large tract of land in the jungle of Guyana, a small English-speaking nation on the northern coast of South America. And Jones now relocated most of his followers there. He told them it was a promised land, a socialist paradise, free of American racism and persecution. The reality for most of the people who arrived, relentless labour in the heat, little food, confiscated passports, censored mail, and armed guards. They could not leave, were thousands of miles from home, in a jungle, with no money and no documents, surrounded by men with guns, listening every day to the amplified voice of Jim Jones, broadcasting over loudspeakers from morning until night. Families those people had left behind in the United States did not stop trying to reach them. Group of relatives and former members organized themselves and pushed for months for someone in authority to investigate what was happening in the jungle. The person who finally agreed to go was a Democratic congressman from California named Leo Ryan. He was 53 years old, a former teacher, known for personally investigating the things he cared about rather than taking briefings on them. In November 1978, he flew to Guyana with a group of journalists, a delegation of concerned relatives, and his own staff, including a young aide named Jackie Spire. Jones stalled the delegation for days, then reluctantly allowed them in. On the first day, November 17, the visit went well enough on the surface. There was the music, the dancing, the meal. But that evening, quietly, a small number of Jonestown residents began passing notes to the visitors. The notes said the same thing. They wanted to leave. They were asking the congressman to take them with him. For Jim Jones, who had built his entire world on the belief that no one would ever abandon him, this was the thing he could not survive. Paradise he had spent his life constructing was in front of outside witnesses and a member of the United States Congress, falling apart in real time. The next afternoon, November 18, Ryan prepared to fly out with the defectors who wanted to go. Group went to the small airstrip at nearby Port Kaituma. Before they had left the camp, a temple member had attacked Ryan with a knife. The congressman was unharmed, but it was a sign of what was coming. At the airstrip, the delegation and the defectors were boarding two small planes. A tractor pulling a trailer approached. Armed men from Jonestown were on it. They opened fire on the group as it tried to board. Congressman Leo Ryan was killed on that airstrip, the first and only sitting member of the United States Congress to be assassinated in the line of his duties in the modern era. 4 others were killed alongside him. An NBC News correspondent named Don Harris, an NBC cameraman named Bob Brown, a newspaper photographer named Greg Robinson, and one of the defectors, a woman named Patricia Parks, who had only been trying to get out. Jackie Spire, the young aide, was shot multiple times and left on the airstrip, badly wounded. She survived. She would go on to spend decades in public life and to serve herself in the United States Congress. Back in Jonestown, Jim Jones gathered his entire community into the central pavilion. He knew that armed men had just killed a United States congressman and that the outside world he feared was now certain to come. He told his followers that the time had arrived. Pot. He called it what he had always called it in the drills. A revolutionary act, not a suicide but a statement. Choice to step out of a world that would never let them be. The entire scene was captured on an audio recording that investigators later recovered. Tape that has become known by a name that needs no explanation. On it, Jones can be heard urging his people to be calm, to be quick, telling them that they were not committing suicide, but performing a revolutionary act, telling them that they could not go back. A large metal vat had been prepared, filled with a powdered fruit drink, mixed with cyanide and sedatives. The children went first. Temple members, including parents and the camp's nurses, used syringes to squirt the poison into the mouths of the babies and the youngest children. More than 300 of the people who died that day were children, and the great majority of them did not choose anything. They were given the poison by the adults who were supposed to protect them. Then the adults took it themselves, lining up the way they had lined up in the drills. The pavilion was ringed by armed guards, some carrying crossbows, positioned to stop anyone who tried to run. Some of the adults drank willingly, in the grip of a belief they had practiced for years. Some did not, forced, or held down, or injected. By the time it was over, more than 900 people lay in and around the pavilion. Jim Jones himself did not die the way his followers did. He was found with a single gunshot wound to the head. He was 47 years old. Full count did not stop in the jungle. That same day, at the People's Temple headquarters in Guyana's capital city of Georgetown, a senior temple member named Sharon Amos took the lives of her 3 children, and then her own, on what she understood to be Jones's instruction. But combined with the 5 killed at the airstrip, the total number of dead from that single day came to 918, when Guyanese soldiers, and soon after, American officials reached Jonestown. They walked into a scene that the people who saw it never fully recovered from describing. The bodies covered the ground around the pavilion, families together, parents with their arms around their children. The process of identifying the dead and returning them to the United States took weeks and overwhelmed the systems meant to handle it. Many of the bodies were never individually identified. Hundreds were eventually buried together in a mass grave in Oakland, California, near where so many of them had lived before Jones took them across the world. There was almost no one left to put on trial. The man responsible was dead, surrounded by his victims. A handful of temple members who had survived faced legal proceedings. One man, Larry Layton, who had taken part in the airstrip attack, was eventually convicted in connection with the assault on the congressman's party. The only person criminally held to account in an American court for any part of what happened that day. Everyone else who could have answered for it had already taken the poison or fled into the jungle. What Jonestown left behind was a wound that went far beyond the families directly involved, though it landed hardest on them, hardest of all on the black community in San Francisco, which lost a generation of its members in a single afternoon, in a country most of them had never planned to die in. It left behind a phrase that entered the language, a casual saying about blindly following a leader, which most people repeat, without remembering that it refers to a vat of poison given to babies through syringes. It left behind a survivor, Jackie Spire, who carried the bullets from that airstrip in her body for the rest of her life, and who chose, instead of hiding from what had happened, to spend her career inside the same institution the congressman had died serving. And it left behind a question that every case on this list keeps asking in a different form, which is how a message that began with feeding the hungry and seating people of every colour at the same table could end with more than 900 bodies in a jungle clearing. The people who died at Jonestown were not, for the most part, cruel or foolish people. Many of them had come to Jim Jones because they wanted a better and fairer world than the one they had been given. That is the part that should frighten anyone. They were idealists. He gave their idealism somewhere to go, and then he took it, along with everything else they had, and finally along with their lives. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Jim Jones spent years convincing his followers that the government was coming to destroy them, ultimately using that fear to lead more than 900 people to their deaths. The next leader on this list preached to a much smaller group in a Texas compound, but the threat he warned about eventually became real. In 1993, federal agents arrived with guns drawn, triggering a 51-day standoff that ended exactly as he had predicted. Compound consumed by fire. Case 3. Waco. It was the morning of Sunday, February 28, 1993, on a stretch of open Texas prairie about 10 miles east of the city of Waco. at a property the people who lived there called Mount Carmel. It was not a compound in the way the word would later be used on the news. It was a sprawling, ramshackle set of buildings where a religious community of around 130 people lived together. Families with children, elderly members, young couples, people from the United States, Britain, Australia, and elsewhere, who had come to study the Bible under one man. There was a chapel, dormitories, a cafeteria, a watchtower. Children rode bicycles in the yard. On that particular morning, the community was preparing for an ordinary Sunday when a line of unmarked cattle trailers came up the long road toward the property. Inside the trailers were more than 70 federal agents in body armor with their weapons ready. By the time the standoff that began that morning finally ended, 51 days later, 4 federal agents and around 80 members of the community would be dead, including roughly 25 children, and the name of a quiet Texas town would become permanent shorthand for one of the most disputed tragedies in American history. The man at the center of it was named David Koresh, though he had been born Vernon Wayne Howell in Houston, Texas in 1959. His childhood had been difficult and lonely. He struggled in school, was dyslexic at a time when that was poorly understood, found his footing only in 2 things: music and the Bible. He could play the guitar, and he could quote scripture, chapter and verse, for hours. As a young man, he found his way to the Branch Davidians, a small religious group that had splintered decades earlier from the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and that had been based at Mount Carmel for years. The group was waiting, as it had always been waiting, for the end of the world and the return of Christ. And they believed that one among them might be the prophet chosen to reveal how it would happen. Vernon Howell rose within the group, and by the late 1980s he had taken control of it, after a bitter and at one point violent struggle with a rival for leadership. In 1990, he legally changed his name to David Koresh. The first name was for the biblical King David. The second was a form of the name of an ancient Persian king, described in scripture as anointed by God. The name was a statement. Koresh told his followers that he was the final prophet, the one who alone could open the 7 seals, described in the book of Revelation, and unlock the meaning of the end times. He never quite claimed to be Jesus, but he placed himself at the absolute center of God's plan, and the people around him believed him completely. What that belief allowed him to do followed the same pattern as the others on this list. Koresh introduced a doctrine he called New Light, under which he declared that he alone was permitted to have wives, and that the other men in the community were to remain celibate, took multiple wives, and some of the girls he took as wives were disturbingly young. Well under the age of consent, he fathered a large number of children within the community. He controlled what the members ate, when they slept, what they read, what they were allowed to believe, and because he was convinced a final battle was coming, he had the group accumulate a large stockpile of firearms and ammunition. The group bought and sold weapons, partly as a business and partly in preparation for the apocalypse. Koresh preached was at hand, with the weapons that brought the federal government to the door. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms had been investigating the Branch Davidians on suspicion that they were illegally converting semi-automatic rifles into fully automatic ones and accumulating parts for prohibited weapons. There were also serious allegations swirling about the abuse of children inside the community. The ATF obtained a search warrant for the property and an arrest warrant for Koresh, and planned a large dramatic raid to serve them dynamic entry, built around the element of surprise. They gave it the code name Showtime. The surprise was lost before the agents ever arrived. A local television reporter had been tipped off about the raid, and while trying to find the property that morning, he asked a passing mail carrier for directions. The mail carrier happened to be a relative of Koresh's, hurried back to Mount Carmel, and warned that the agents were coming. The commanders were told the element of surprise was gone. They sent the agents in anyway. At around 9:45 in the morning, as the agents moved on the buildings, gunfire erupted. To this day, two sides disagree about who fired first. The agents said shots came from inside the buildings, and the surviving Davidians insisted the agents fired first. What is not in dispute is the result. After a gun battle that lasted the better part of an hour, 4 ATF agents were no longer alive. Around 15 more were wounded. 6 members of the community had also lost their lives. It was the deadliest single day in the history of the Bureau up to that point. Ceasefire was arranged over the telephone, and the agents withdrew. At that point, the Federal Bureau of Investigation took over. What followed was a siege that lasted 51 days, and that much of the country watched unfold on live television. The FBI surrounded Mount Carmel with agents, armoured vehicles and negotiators. Over the weeks that followed, negotiators spoke with Koresh and others inside for well over 100 hours. Slowly, a number of people were allowed to come out, including many children, more than 40 people in total over the course of the standoff. But Koresh kept delaying. He told negotiators that God had instructed him to wait, that he needed to finish writing out his interpretation of the 7 seals before he would surrender, and the people who remained inside, dozens of adults and their children, stayed with him. As the siege dragged on, the conditions and the pressure escalated on both sides. The FBI cut the power. They blasted loud music and recorded sounds at the buildings through the night to wear the people inside down. Inside, the community held on, listening to Koresh, certain that the government surrounding them was the enemy that Scripture had promised would come. Proof. The fear of an apocalyptic confrontation with the authorities, which Koresh had been preaching for years, was now sitting in armoured vehicles in their own front yard. The thing he had told them to expect had arrived, and that may have been the most dangerous part of all, because it confirmed everything he had ever said. On the morning of April 19, 1993, 51st day, the FBI moved to end it. With the approval of the Attorney General, the plan was to use armoured vehicles to punch holes in the buildings and pump in CS gas, a form of tear gas, to force the people inside to come out. The assault began in the early morning. Armoured vehicles tore into the walls. Gas was pumped into the buildings for hours. People inside did not come out. Then, around noon, fire broke out in several places in the wooden buildings at once, and within minutes the entire structure was engulfed. A strong prairie wind drove the flames through the dry buildings with terrible speed. 9 people escaped the fire, alive. When it was over and the ruins had cooled, the remains of around 76 people were recovered from Mount Carmel. Roughly 25 of them were children. David Koresh was among the dead. He was 33 years old and was found to have died of a gunshot wound to the head rather than the fire itself. He was not the only one. Investigators concluded that a number of the adults inside had been shot, including some of the children's mothers, in what the government described as either a planned act among the group or the killing of people who tried to flee. How the fire started is, 3 decades later, still genuinely disputed, and an honest account has to say so. The federal government maintained, citing forensic evidence and an account from a surviving member, that the Branch Davidians had deliberately set the fire themselves. This was the fiery end. Koresh had been promising his followers all along. Survivors and a number of critics argued that the government's assault, the gas, the methods used, and the breaching of the buildings created the conditions for the fire, and bore responsibility for the deaths, multiple investigations, and a set of contentious congressional hearings followed in the years afterward. The Attorney General publicly took responsibility for the decision to go in. No clean, universally accepted account of that final morning has ever emerged, and that uncertainty is part of why the case never closed in the public mind. What is not uncertain is the aftermath, and it reached far beyond Texas. A handful of surviving Branch Davidians were later prosecuted. Some were convicted on charges related to the deaths of the federal agents and to weapons violations, and served time for, though the most serious theories against them did not hold up in the way prosecutors had hoped. The deeper consequence of Waco was political and cultural. To a growing movement of Americans who already distrusted the federal government, the image of tanks and gas and a burning building full of families became proof of everything they feared. The date itself, April 19, became a kind of dark anniversary. Exactly 2 years later, on April 19, 1995, a young man named Timothy McVeigh had travelled to Waco during the siege and seethed about it for years. Detonated a truck bomb outside a federal building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 people, including small children, in a daycare on the second floor. He said afterward that he had done it in part as revenge for Waco. The fire at Mount Carmel, in other words, did not end with the people who died in it. That is what makes Waco different from most of the cases on this list, and worth sitting with. The other groups here died in private, away from any outside witness, because of what their leaders did to them. People at Mount Carmel died in front of the entire country, in a confrontation between a man who had convinced his followers that the government would one day come to destroy them, and a government that then, however it happened, came up the driveway with armoured vehicles and left a building full of children in ashes. Both of those things are true at once. People who paid for the collision of the two were overwhelmingly the people with the least power in the whole story. The adults inside had chosen David Koresh. The 25 children had not chosen anything. They had been born into a community on a Texas prairie, parents who believed a man who told them the end of the world was coming. And for them, on April 19, 1993, it did. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. People at Waco died in a confrontation the entire world watched on live television. The next group died the opposite way, in secret, scattered across 2 countries on the same nights, in fires that were carefully staged to hide what had really happened inside. Case 4. The Order of the Solar Temple. It was the early hours of Wednesday, October 5, 1994, in the mountains of the Valais, in the French-speaking part of Switzerland, near a quiet village called Sylvan. The kind of place tourists drive through on the way to somewhere else. Steep alpine slopes, scattered chalets, the lights of a few farmhouses in the dark. Some time after midnight, a fire was spotted at one of the chalets. Then, in the canton of Fribourg, an hour or so away, near a village called Cheery, another fire was found at a farmhouse. When firefighters and police reached the buildings and went inside, they walked into something they had no framework for. Host. In an underground room at the Cheery farmhouse that had been converted into a kind of temple, lined with mirrors and draped in red fabric, found 23 bodies. Many of them were laid out on the floor in a circle, their feet pointing inward like the spokes of a wheel, their heads pointing out. Some had plastic bags over their heads. Some had been shot. At Salvan, more bodies were found among the flames. And across the Atlantic Ocean, in the province of Quebec in Canada, fire crews had already found another 5. By the time that single week was over, 53 members of a secretive group called the Order of the Solar Temple were no longer alive. And the deaths had been so carefully arranged in 2 countries on the same nights that investigators spent years trying to understand exactly what they had found. The Order of the Solar Temple had been founded a decade earlier, in 1984, by 2 men who could not have looked more respectable. The first was Joseph Di Mambro, a Frenchman born in 1924, a watchmaker and jeweller by training, who had spent his adult life moving through various esoteric and occult societies, and who had a quiet criminal history of fraud, including once impersonating a psychiatrist. The second was Luc Jouret, Belgian, born in 1947, a charming and articulate medical doctor who had become a popular speaker on the New Age lecture circuit in French-speaking Europe and in Quebec, drawing crowds to talks on health, nature, and spiritual renewal. Di Mambro provided the hidden machinery and the money. Jouret provided the public face, the voice, the charisma that brought people in. Together, they built an order that wrapped itself in the imagery of the medieval Knights Templar, complete with robes, swords, ceremonies, ranks of initiation. What set the Solar Temple apart from the popular image of a cult was the kind of person it attracted. These were not runaways or the desperate poor. The order recruited the comfortable and the accomplished, professionals, business owners, civil servants, a mayor, a journalist, scientists, people with money and standing who were looking for meaning in a modern world that seemed to have stopped offering any. Among the members was the family of Jean Vuarnet, a famous French Olympic skiing champion turned successful businessman. His wife and his son both became deeply involved. These were people with everything to live for, by any ordinary measure. That is exactly what made what happened to them so frightening to the public when it finally came out. If this could reach these people, it could reach anyone. At the heart of the order was a single seductive idea. Di Mambro and Jouret taught their followers that the world was corrupt and headed for catastrophe, and that the members of the order were spiritually superior beings who did not truly belong to this earth at all. Death, in their teaching, was not an ending. It was a doorway. They called it the transit. The members were told that when the time came, they would shed their physical bodies and travel to a higher plane of existence. A new world associated with the star Sirius, where they would live on as enlightened beings. Death was reframed completely as a graduation. To make this believable, Di Mambro ran an elaborate deception behind the scenes. In the Order's sanctuaries, he used hidden electronic devices and staged optical effects to produce what members were told were genuine apparitions of holy figures and ascended masters. People who handed over their fortunes believed they were witnessing the divine. They were watching a magic trick performed by a former jeweller, and they did hand over their fortunes. The Order extracted enormous sums of money from its members over the years, and that money, along with the secrecy and the absolute control Di Mambro held over people's beliefs, was the engine of the whole thing. But by the early 1990s, the structure was beginning to crack. There were internal disputes over money. Members were starting to ask questions. Some wanted to leave. In Canada, Jouret had gotten into legal trouble after directing members to illegally acquire firearm silencers, which brought police attention the Order had never wanted. Di Mambro's health was failing, and his grip was loosening. And as the cracks spread, the two leaders, increasingly paranoid and convinced they were being persecuted, began to plan the transit, not as a distant spiritual promise, but as a concrete event they would carry out themselves. There was one family that turned the planning toward violence. A former member named Antonio Dutoit and his wife had broken with the Order, and worse, in Di Mambro's eyes, they had a baby son. DiMambro had a fixation on a cosmic child within the movement, his own daughter, whom he had built up as a spiritually exalted being. He came to see the Dutot infant as a kind of rival, an obstacle, and in his deranged theology, he labelled the baby the Antichrist. When the decision to begin the transit was made, the Dutot family was first, in late September and early October 1994, at a house in Morin Heights, Quebec. Antonio Dutot, his wife, and their 3-month-old son were killed. The baby was 3 months old. The members who carried out the killings then died in the same house, and a fire was set. On the same nights, Switzerland, the larger transit unfolded. At the farmhouse near Sherry, around 24 members died. Investigators came to believe that many of the people there had been considered traitors or weak links, people who might have exposed the order, or who no longer fully believed, and that they had been killed, shot, and in some cases suffocated, rather than choosing to die. At the chalets near Salvan, another group died, and it was there that the 2 founders ended their own lives. Joseph DiMambro was 70 years old. Luc Jouret was 46. Both died by poison, surrounded by the followers they had spent a decade preparing for this exact night. The fires had been timed. Devices had been rigged to set the buildings alight after the deaths, so that the scenes would burn. The picture that slowly emerged was the most disturbing part. The deaths of the Solar Temple were not a simple mass suicide. They were not a simple massacre. They were both at the same time. Some of the people who died were true believers who went willingly, convinced they were boarding a vessel to a better world. Some were murdered because the leaders had decided they could not be allowed to live or to talk. Many of them had been lured to the locations on the promise that the money they had given the order would finally be returned to them, and the entire thing had been staged with care. The robes, the temple room, the bodies arranged in their wheel, because DiMambro wanted the world to read the scene a certain way. In the days afterward, letters arrived at newspapers, the homes of former members, and at the offices of scholars who studied religion. The letters had been mailed by members of the order before the deaths, and they explained, in the order's own grand and serene language, that what had happened was not a tragedy at all, but a glorious transit, a voluntary departure from a doomed world. There was almost no one left to hold responsible. The leaders were dead among their own victims, exactly as they had planned. There would be no trial of Joseph DiMambro, no testimony from Luc Jouret, no reckoning in a courtroom. The investigators in Switzerland, France, Canada, were left to reconstruct what had happened from the burned remains, the bodies, and the letters of the dead. And then, just as the world was beginning to absorb the first wave and to assume it was over, it happened again. In December 1995, more than a year after the first deaths, 16 more members of the order were found dead on a remote plateau in the Vercors mountains of France. They too were arranged in a star formation. They too had been drugged and shot, and the site had been set on fire. Among the dead this second time was Patrick Vuarnet, the young son of the skiing champion, the same man who had personally mailed out the order's letters explaining the first transit a year earlier. He had helped the world understand the first wave of deaths, and then he had joined the second. And even that was not the end. In March 1997, in the village of Saint Casimir in Quebec, 5 more members died in another staged fire. In that final case, there were teenagers in the house, the children of members, and at the last moment the adults relented and let the young people go. The teenagers walked out and survived. The adults stayed and died. By the time it was finished, across 3 countries and 3 separate waves between 1994 and 1997, 74 people connected to the Order of the Solar Temple were no longer alive. what the Solar Temple left behind was a particular kind of fear that the other cases on this list do not quite carry. There was no compound full of the poor and the lost, no jungle, no leader who looked obviously dangerous. A respected doctor giving health lectures to well-dressed audiences, and a quiet jeweller and a membership of professionals and Olympians and civil servants with money in the bank and families and reputations. These were people who, from the outside, appeared to have already found everything that life is supposed to offer, and a single, well-packaged idea that death was not death but a door, that they were special beings who did not belong to this world, was enough to lead them to lay themselves down on the floor of a mirrored room in the Swiss mountains in the shape of a wheel and to let the timers count down to the fire. The people who recruited them understood something that every leader on this list understood. They understood that the most powerful thing you can offer a frightened, searching person is not money or comfort, but meaning. Once a person believes you hold the key to what their life is for, there is very little they will not eventually do at your word. Di Mambro and Jure offered the stars. They charged everything their followers had to give, and in the end, they took even the distinction between being saved and being killed, and burned it on the same night, in 2 countries at once, so that no one would ever be entirely sure which of the dead had wanted to go. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Solar Temple promised its members a new life on a world among the stars, dressed their deaths up as a voyage. The next group believed almost exactly the same thing, in almost the same words, except they were not waiting for a star. They were waiting for a spacecraft, hidden in the tail of a comet, to come and carry them away. Case 5. Heaven's Gate. In the early spring of 1997, anyone who walked outside on a clear night and looked up could see it. Comet Hale Bopp was passing closer to Earth than it had in thousands of years, and it hung in the night sky over North America as one of the brightest and most beautiful comets of the entire century. Smear of light with a long tail, visible to the naked eye for weeks. Millions of people stepped into their backyards to look at it. Children were lifted up to see it. It was, for most of the world, simply a rare and wonderful thing, the kind of sight a person remembers for the rest of their life. But in a quiet, gated, upscale community north of San Diego, called Rancho Santa Fe, beside a sprawling rented mansion on a hill, 39 people were looking at that same comet and seeing something entirely different. They were not seeing a comet. They believed they were seeing the signal they had waited more than 20 years for, the sign that it was finally time to leave. By the time deputies entered that mansion on March 26, 1997, all 39 of them, including their leader, would be lying peacefully on their beds no longer alive. Dressed identically, their bags packed beside them, ready for a journey they were certain was about to begin. The group was called Heaven's Gate, and it had begun more than 2 decades earlier with 2 people. The first was Marshall Applewhite, a former music professor, the son of a Presbyterian minister, a charismatic and troubled man who had struggled for years with his own identity and direction. The second was Bonnie Lou Nettles, a nurse with a deep interest in mysticism and the occult. The 2 of them met in the early 1970s, formed an intense and entirely non-romantic partnership, and became convinced that they were the 2 witnesses described in the Book of Revelation, sent to Earth from a higher level of existence on a divine mission. They called themselves simply the 2. Later they took the names Do and T, like notes on a musical scale. In the mid-1970s, Applewhite and Nettles began traveling the United States, recruiting followers to a strange new belief that blended Christianity, science fiction, and the language of the space age. So, they told the people they met that the human body was not who they really were. It was only a temporary container, a vehicle, kind of spacesuit worn by the soul. They taught that there was a level of existence above the human one, which they called the evolutionary level, above human, and that a person could graduate to it, leaving behind the body the way a caterpillar leaves behind its cocoon. To get there, member had to shed everything that tied them to the human world. The people who joined gave up their names, their families, their jobs, their money, and their possessions. They cut off contact with parents and children. They lived together in tight, disciplined communal groups, moving from place to place, governed by an enormous set of rules covering nearly every minute of the day. The discipline was total, and it extended even to the body itself. Applewhite preached complete abstinence from sex and from anything that stirred the desires of the container. To remove temptation entirely, several of the male members, including Applewhite himself, voluntarily underwent surgical castration. The group became known in the press, when it was known at all, as a UFO cult, because at the center of everything was the belief that a spacecraft from the next level would one day come to collect them, and that their time on Earth was only a classroom, a temporary assignment they would graduate from when the lesson was complete. Bonnie Nettles, the other half of the two, died of cancer in 1985. Her death was a profound problem for the group's theology because she had not been taken away on a spacecraft. Her body had simply failed and been buried like anyone else's. Applewhite reinterpreted it. He taught that TI had gone ahead of them, shedding her container early, and was waiting for the rest of them at the next level. He led the group alone after that, and through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, they kept to themselves, supporting themselves quietly. By the mid-1990s, in a detail that made the group feel eerily modern, they had gone into the technology business. Several members ran a small web design company called Higher Source, building websites for paying clients in the earliest days of the public internet. They were polite, competent, and completely ordinary to deal with. The people who hired them had no idea what the men in the matching haircuts believed. What changed everything was the comet. Hale-Bopp was discovered in 1995, and as it approached, amateur astronomer claimed to have spotted a mysterious companion object trailing along behind it. The claim was false. There was no companion object, only a misidentified star. But the rumour spread for Applewhite and his followers. It was the answer they had been waiting for. They became convinced that the object behind Hale-Bopp was the spacecraft from the next level, sent to collect them at last. The classroom was ending. Graduation had come. In October 1996, the group rented the large mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, telling the owner they were a group of Christian monks, and they began, calmly and methodically, to prepare to leave. Nothing frantic about the preparation. And that is the part that has unsettled people for almost 30 years. The members recorded farewell videos, sitting in front of the camera one by one, smiling, describing how excited they were to finally be going home. They did not seem afraid. They seemed relieved, even joyful, like travellers about to board a flight they had been waiting their whole lives to take. They updated their website with a final message, announcing that Hale-Bopp had brought closure to Heaven's Gate, that their 22 years of classroom on planet Earth was coming to its conclusion, and that they were graduating. In late March 1997, the comet reached its closest point to the Earth. The 39 of them carried out the plan they had agreed on. They did it in waves, course of about 3 days, in a small group, so that some members could assist the others, and then, at the end, the last few could complete the process themselves. They each consumed a mixture of a powerful sedative, phenobarbital, blended into pudding or applesauce, washed down with vodka, and then they lay down. Each of them was dressed exactly the same, black shirts and black sweatpants, with brand new black and white Nike athletic shoes on their feet. The upper part of each body was placed a neat purple cloth. In the pocket of each person was a $5 bill and 3/4, and many had identification and small packed travel bags set beside their beds, as if they were going on a trip and might need a little money and their papers when they arrived. They believed completely they were leaving their containers behind in that mansion, and that they themselves, their true selves, step aboard the craft and be carried to the next level. The bodies were discovered after a former member, host, who had received one of the farewell packages in the mail, grew alarmed and called the authorities. When San Diego County Sheriff's deputies entered the mansion, they found the 39 laid out in an orderly, almost serene arrangement throughout the house. There were 21 women and 18 men, ranging widely in age. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, no indication that a single one of them had been forced or had resisted. Marshall Applewhite was among them. He was 65 years old. The scene was so calm and so deliberate that the deputies and investigators who walked through it struggled, afterward, to put words to what they had seen. It did not look like a crime scene. It looked like a group of people who had quietly and willingly walked out a door together. There was no one to arrest. There was no surviving leader to put on trial, no perpetrator hiding in another country, confession to extract. Everyone who had organised it had taken part in it. What the case left behind instead was a question that has no comfortable answer. These were not, for the most part, people who had been kidnapped or held against their will. They were adults, many of them intelligent and capable, people who built websites and held jobs and could have walked out the front door at any moment over the previous 20 years. They stayed, they believed, and in the end they lay down in matching shoes with a few dollars in their pockets, because a man they trusted had told them that a spaceship behind a comet was coming to take them home, and they wanted, more than they wanted to keep living, for it to be true. The aftermath had a grim final chapter. In the months and the year that followed, a small number of people connected to the group who had not been in the mansion that week attempted to follow the 39 in the same way, to catch up to the spacecraft they believed had already come. One of them died. The belief did not end cleanly with the bodies in Rancho Santa Fe. The mansion itself was eventually torn down, and the street it stood on was renamed, because too many curious strangers kept driving up the hill to look at it, the same way the Cielo Drive house had drawn them decades before. And in one of the stranger legacies of any case on this list, the group's website, with its careful explanations of containers and vehicles and the level above human, has remained online for decades, quietly maintained, still inviting anyone who finds it to understand what the 39 believed they were doing. The thing that makes Heaven's Gate different from the violence of Jonestown's or the staged carnage of the Solasor Temple is precisely how gentle it appeared on the surface. No one was shot, no children were poisoned with syringes, no guards stood at the doors with crossbows. People of Heaven's Gate went the way they had lived for 20 years, in matching clothes, in perfect order, calm certainty that they were not dying at all but graduating. And that is its own kind of warning. Host, the most complete control a person can have over another, is not the control that forces them to do something against their will, is the control that makes them want it, that makes them lie down smiling, that turns the most final and irreversible act a human being can commit into something they believe they are lucky to be allowed to do. Marshall Applewhite did not have to make anyone afraid. He only had to make them believe. 39 people looked up at one of the most beautiful sights in the night sky that spring. The same comet that millions of others simply admired, and they saw in it permission to leave the world behind. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The people of Heaven's Gate went quietly, willingly, 39 of them, convinced they were graduating to something better. The next group numbered in the hundreds, in the hills of Uganda, Prod, and when the day they had been promised for the end of the world came and went, their leaders did not let them go home. They locked them inside a church and set it on fire. Case 6. The movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God. It was the morning of Friday, March 17, 2000, in the green, terraced hills of Kanungu, a remote district in the far southwest of Uganda, several hours of bad road from the capital. The kind of place where the land is beautiful and the life is hard, where families grow what they eat on steep hillsides, and the nearest town is a small trading centre. On a compound built on a hillside there, hundreds of people had gathered that morning, members of a religious movement, many of whom had all sold everything they owned, their land, their cattle, their homes, and given the money to the group. They had been told that this day was a day of celebration. A feast had been prepared, filed into the movement's church. A long building on the property, dressed in the green and white and black robes the group wore, and the doors were closed. What the people inside did not know, or could no longer do anything about, was that the windows had been boarded over, and the doors had been secured from the outside. A short time later, the building was set on fire. By the time investigators had finished their grim work across that district, in the weeks that followed, death toll, connected to that single movement, would climb past 700, making it, at the time, deadliest event of its kind in modern history. Deadlier even than Jonestown. The movement was called the Movement for the Restoration of the 10 Commandments of God. To understand how it grew, you have to understand the place and the moment. Uganda in the late 20th century had lived through enormous upheaval, brutal dictatorship, civil war, and the devastation of the AIDS epidemic, which had torn through the country and left behind orphans, grief, deep hunger, for something that could make sense of so much suffering. It was also a country of profound religious faith, much of it Roman Catholic, and a country where reports of visions of the Virgin Mary were taken with great seriousness. Into that landscape, in the late 1980s, came a movement built around exactly such visions. At its centre were a handful of figures. The most important was a woman named Credonia Mwerinde. Before the movement, she had run a shop and brewed banana beer. By some accounts, had worked as a prostitute, and she had a reputation as a woman whose life had not gone the way she wanted. Then she began to say that the Virgin Mary was appearing to her and speaking through her, delivering messages about the corruption of the modern world and the urgent need to return to the 10 Commandments before it was too late. She became the spiritual engine of the movement, and within it she was known by a chilling nickname. Members called her the Programmer. Alongside her was Joseph Kibwetire, an older man, a former politician and devout Catholic of some local standing, who also claimed to have received a vision of the Virgin Mary, and who lent the movement respectability and organisation. Was also a man named Dominic Kataribabo, a former Catholic priest, an educated man who had even studied abroad, and whose involvement gave the group theological weight. Together, they preached a single urgent message. The world was ending, 10 commandments had been abandoned and judgment was coming. The only safe place, the only ark, was inside their movement. Life inside the movement for the restoration of the 10 commandments of God was severe. Members were required to give up their possessions, sold their property, and handed the proceeds to the leadership, because money and land would mean nothing in the world that was coming. They worked long hours of hard labour on the group's compounds. They fasted often. And in one of the movement's strangest disciplines, they were discouraged from speaking. Because the leaders taught that the tongue was the source of sin and lies, so members communicated largely through gestures and sign language to avoid breaking the commandments. Children were part of the community too, and were separated from ordinary schooling and ordinary life. The members wore uniforms in the movement's colours. They lived almost entirely cut off from the outside world on hillsides far from the cities, listening to leaders who told them that the end was very near and that obedience was the only path through it. The end, the leaders said, come with the turn of the millennium. The world would not survive past the start of the year 2000. This was the promise around which everything else was organised. The reason members had sold their land and abandoned their old lives, because none of it would matter after the world ended. And then the 1st of January 2000 arrived. The sun came up, and the world was exactly where it had been the day before. Nothing happened. This is the fracture point that appears, in one form or another, in so many of these cases. A leader makes a specific, dramatic prophecy. The date arrives, the prophecy fails, and the followers, given up everything on the strength of that promise, are left standing in the wreckage of their own faith, asking the most dangerous question a follower can ask, which is whether any of it was ever true. In Kanungu, failed prophecy created exactly that crisis. Members who had sold their homes and their cattle and handed over the money began to want it back. They had given up their entire lives for a day that had come and gone. Some of them grew angry. Some of them began to demand answers and to demand their property. The absolute authority the leaders had held was suddenly in question, and the movement that depended on that authority was beginning to come apart. What the leaders did in response is the reason this case is now classified, officially, as a mass murder rather than a mass suicide. That distinction was not clear at first, and has been argued over since. In the weeks leading up to March 17, investigators later concluded the leaders quietly began killing the members who had become a problem, the ones who were asking for their money, the ones whose faith had broken. These people were not burned. They were killed at the movement's other compounds scattered around the region by poisoning, by strangulation, by stabbing, and their bodies were buried in pits, in latrines, and beneath the floors of buildings, hidden away weeks before the fire. The dissenters were being removed, one site at a time, and no one on the outside knew. Then came the 17th of March. A new date had been given to the remaining faithful, and they were told to gather for a great celebration. They came to the church on the main compound in Kanungu, in their hundreds. They went inside. The building was sealed from the outside. An accelerant had been prepared. The church was set alight, and the people trapped inside, behind boarded windows and bolted doors, did not survive. More than 300 people died in that fire, and many accounts put the number considerably higher, well over 500. Among them were children. They were burned alive in the building they had been told was their refuge from the end of the world, by the very people they had trusted to save them. In the first days, the world's press reported it as a mass suicide, a single horrifying act of self-destruction by a doomsday cult. But as Ugandan police began to investigate, they went to the movement's other sites. What they found changed the entire story. At one compound after another, they uncovered mass graves. Beneath a house belonging to the former priest of Kataribabo, they found bodies. In pits and latrines at other sites, they found more, scores at a time. People had not died in any fire. They had been killed earlier, deliberately and concealed. As the searches went on, total number of dead climbed past 500, then past 700, and credible estimates ran higher still, because some suspected grave sites were never fully excavated. The searches overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what had happened. Official toll is usually given as around 780. It may well have been more. It was, at the time, the largest death toll of any such event in the modern era. And then there is the detail that sets this case, apart from almost every other one on this list. No one was ever held to account. The leaders of the movement, the people who organised the killings and lit the fire, were never arrested, tried, never convicted. For a time it was assumed they had died in the church fire alongside their followers, but investigators came to suspect otherwise. A vehicle that normally sat at the Kanungu compound was missing after the blaze. Proceeds of everything the members had sold, the money from all that land and all those cattle, was unaccounted for. The suspicion grew that Credonia Mwerinde, the programmer, and Joseph Kibwetire, and perhaps others, had not died with their flock at all, but had taken the money and slipped away before the fire was ever lit. Sightings were reported for years afterward. None was ever confirmed. To this day, it is genuinely unknown whether the leaders of the deadliest cult killing in modern history died in the flames they set, or walked away from them and lived out their lives somewhere under other names. No one was ever brought to justice for the deaths of more than 700 people. What makes Kanungu sit so heavily, beyond the sheer numbers, is how completely it has been forgotten by much of the world. Jonestown, Waco, Heaven's Gate, these are names that an enormous number of people recognise instantly. But more people died on that hillside in southwest Uganda than at Jonestown. Most people outside Uganda have never heard of it. The victims were poor farmers and their families in a remote corner of Africa, and the world that pays close attention to some tragedy. Tragedies looked away from this one almost as soon as the smoke cleared. They were people who had been through war and disease and poverty, who wanted, more than anything, to believe that there was a way to be safe and to be good in a world that had given them every reason to despair. A woman who said the Virgin Mary spoke through her offered them that, and a structure, and a community, and a promise. And when the promise failed and the people began to doubt, the answer was the pit and the fire. The hillsides around Kanungu still hold the graves. Families in that district lost mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers and children. And many of them never recovered a body to bury, because the dead could not be told apart. The few real survivors of the movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God were, for the most part, the people who had grown disillusioned and left before March 17, and who spent the rest of their lives knowing how narrowly they had stepped out of the path of it. The movement's leaders may have died with their followers. They may have grown old and free on other people's money. Those things remain possible a quarter of a century later. And that unresolved question is its own kind of wound, because it means that the worst of these crimes is also the one that was never answered for at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Kanungu was hundreds of strangers bound together by a leader who wanted their money and their obedience. The next case was the opposite in almost every way. It was a single family, 11 people related by blood, in an ordinary house in the middle of a busy Indian city, who all died together in one night on the written instructions of a man who had been dead for more than a decade. Case 7, the Barari deaths. It was the morning of Sunday, July 1, 2018, in Barari, a crowded, working-class neighbourhood in the north of Delhi. The kind of place where the houses are stacked close together, where the lanes are narrow, everyone knows their neighbours and the shops open early. On a street called Santnagar stood a 3-storey house belonging to a family that had there for around 2 decades. They ran a small grocery shop and a plywood business nearby, and the shops usually opened by 5 or 5:30 in the morning. On this particular morning they stayed shut. A neighbour named Gurcharan Singh took his morning walk with one of the family's sons, noticed the man had not come out and that the shops were dark. He went to the house. The front door was open. He stepped inside, climbed toward the first floor, and saw something that he would never be able to unsee. 10 members of the family were hanging from an iron mesh grill set into the ceiling of the hallway. Close together, blindfolded, their mouths taped, their hands bound. The 11th, the 80-year-old grandmother, was lying dead in another room. By the time the sun was fully up over Barari, all 11 members of one ordinary, respected, middle-class family were no longer alive, and India was facing one of the most baffling and disturbing cases in its modern history. The family was the Chundawat family, also known by the surname Bhatia. They had moved to Delhi years earlier from a town in the state of Haryana. By every account from the people who knew them, they were a model family. They were hard-working, religious, polite, and close. 3 generations lived together on one roof. The shops were doing well. The household had a reputation in the neighbourhood for being decent, disciplined people who kept to themselves and caused no trouble. In the days before their deaths, they had not been in mourning or in crisis. They had been celebrating. One of the granddaughters had recently gotten engaged, and a wedding was being planned. To everyone around them, nothing was wrong. That is the detail that makes this case so hard to absorb. There was no outward sign, none at all, what was happening inside that house. To understand what happened, you have to go back 11 years to 2007, when the head of the household, a man named Bhopal Singh, died of natural causes. He was the patriarch, the anchor of the family. His death hit one of his sons, Lalit, especially hard. Lalit had already lived through trauma in his life, including a period when he had lost the ability to speak for some time after an accident. After his father's death, Lalit became withdrawn, and then within a few weeks, he began to claim something extraordinary. He said that his dead father was speaking to him. He said his father's spirit visited him, communicated through him, and gave the family instructions on how to live. The family believed him. This is the heart of the case, and it is the part that no diagram of a cult quite prepares you for, because there was no outside leader here, no compound, no recruiter, no charismatic stranger. The leader was one of their own, a son and a brother, and the deity they came to obey was their own dead father, speaking, they believed, through Lalit. Over the years that followed, Lalit relayed his father's instructions, and the family began to record them. They kept diaries. Register after register, filled with the guidance the spirit it supposedly gave. These notebooks accumulated over more than a decade, written in the handwriting of more than one family member, and they governed the household in growing detail, dictating prayers, rituals, behaviour, rules of daily life. And here is the thing that made the belief so durable. Following the instructions seemed to work. After the family began living by the diaries, their fortunes improved. The businesses did better. The household became more prosperous. The recent engagement of the granddaughter, after what had been a difficult search for a match, was taken as further proof. To the family, this was evidence that the father spirit was real, that Lalit was a genuine channel to him, Frost, and that obedience to the instructions brought protection and success. Every good thing that happened reinforced the belief, and the belief reinforced Lalit's authority, until the line between the living son and the dead father had dissolved completely in the minds of everyone in that house. What the investigators and psychologists who later studied the case came to describe was a phenomenon sometimes called a shared psychosis, a delusion that begins in one person and spreads to others around them who are close and trusting. In this instance, it had spread through an entire family, across 3 generations, and had been sustained in secret for 11 years. People inside the house were not being held prisoner. They went to work. They went to the market. The children went to school. The granddaughter went out to meet the man she was going to marry. And then they came home, a private world in which a dead man gave orders through his son. And they wrote those orders down in their notebooks. No one outside the family ever suspected a thing. The final entries in the diaries described a ritual. It was modelled, investigators believed, on the image of a banyan tree, a tree considered sacred in Hindu tradition, with its many hanging roots. The instructions called for the family to hang themselves from the ceiling grill in a particular arrangement, their bodies suspended like the roots of the tree as an act of devotion. And this is the most important fact in the entire case, the one that turns it from a simple mass suicide into something stranger and sadder. The family did not believe they were going to die. The notes made clear that they expected to survive the ritual. They believed that the father's spirit would protect them. They would hang only briefly, that they would be saved, and that the family would emerge from the ritual stronger and more blessed than before. They had even, according to the diaries, planned to perform the ritual again afterward, with a relative who was facing difficulties. They were not planning their deaths. They were planning what they thought was a temporary act of faith with a happy ending. On the night of June 30, going into July 1, they carried it out. Security camera footage from the neighbourhood, recovered later, showed the ordinariness of the preparations in a way that is genuinely chilling. It showed family members calmly carrying stools into the house, showed 2 of the teenage boys walking to the family plywood shop and fetching the wires and cables that would be used. There was no struggle, panic, no sign of anyone being forced. They prepared the way you might prepare for any household task. Then, sometime around 1 in the morning, the 10 of them positioned themselves on the stools, beneath the grill, blindfolded and gagged and bound in the arrangement the diaries had described. The bindings and the blindfolds, very things that made the scene look like a murder. 2. The first people who saw it were almost certainly part of the ritual itself, plied by the family members to one another, and finally, by the last person able to move. What seems to have gone wrong is simple and terrible. They believed they would be held only briefly and then rescued. They were not rescued. The stools shifted or were knocked away. Partial hangings the family had imagined as symbolic became fatal. 10 of them died. The 11th, the 80-year-old grandmother, Narayani Devi, was found in a separate room, and the evidence suggested she had died by strangulation rather than hanging, possibly because her age made the sealing ritual impossible for her, and she was killed separately as part of the same night. The dead ranged in age from the 80-year-old matriarch down to 2 15-year-old boys. They were grandmothers and mothers and fathers, and a widowed aunt and young adults and children, all of one family, all gone in a single night, on the written instructions of a man who had been dead for 11 years. The investigation that followed had to rule out the most obvious explanations one by one. At first, it looked like a mass murder because of the bindings and the gags, but there was no sign of forced entry, no sign of an intruder, no sign of a struggle. and the security footage showed the family doing everything themselves. The post-mortem examinations and the recovered diaries pointed, in the end, to the same conclusion the police reached, that this was a ritual the family had performed on themselves, believing they would live under the spell of a shared delusion that had taken root over more than a decade. There was no villain to arrest, because the person who had led them, Lalit, had died alongside them, hanging from the same grill, having brought his entire family with him into a belief that killed them all. What the Barari case leaves behind is different from the other cases on this list, and in some ways it is the most unsettling precisely because it was so small and so intimate. There was no compound, no army of followers, no leader hungry for money or power over strangers. There was a loving, successful, devoted family, the kind of family any neighbour would have pointed to as an example, and inside it, a belief that grew quietly in the dark for 11 years, and was never spoken aloud to anyone outside the walls of the house. People who died trusted the person who led them more completely than the followers of any distant guru ever could, because the person who led them was their own son, their own brother, their own family, relaying the voice of a father they had all loved and lost. They were not chasing a spaceship or a new world or the end of days. They only wanted to keep the blessing they believed they had found, and to stay they had always been together. They wrote it all down in their notebooks, year after year, and on the last night they followed the final instruction, certain it would not be the last thing they ever did. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Barari family followed the voice of a dead man because they believed he was speaking through someone they loved. The next case moved that same idea out of one quiet house and onto the front pages of America, where a mother became convinced that her own children had turned into something evil, and the man who told her so was not a dead father, but a living author who wrote novels about the end of the world. Case 8. Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell. It was the late summer of 2019 in the small, dry mountain range town of Rexburg in eastern Idaho, the kind of place where the streets are wide and quiet, where a university anchors the community, where families move to raise children in safety. A woman named Lori Vallow had recently arrived in the area with her two youngest children. The oldest of the two was a 16-year-old girl named Tylee Ryan, a bright, funny teenager who loved spending time with her mother and had recently gone on a trip with her to Yellowstone National Park. The younger was a 7-year-old boy named Joshua, whom everyone called JJ. He was a happy, affectionate child with autism, adopted by Lori and her late husband, a little boy who loved his grandparents and was known for his wide smile. In September of 2019, children simply stopped being seen. The last time anyone outside the household laid eyes on Tylee was in early September. The last time anyone saw JJ was at the end of that same month. When relatives asked where the children were, Lori told a series of shifting, possible answers. By the time their bodies were recovered, buried on a rural property the following summer, the case had grown into one of the most disturbing American crime stories of its era, because the woman at the centre of it was their own mother. And the reason she gave herself for what happened to them was that they were no longer really her children at all. To understand how Lori Vallow arrived at that belief, you have to go back several years and follow a slow, strange transformation. For most of her adult life, Lori had been, by the accounts of the people who knew her, a devoted and even doting mother. She was warm, attentive, deeply involved in her children's lives. A practicing member of her faith, a woman who organised her world around her family. she had been married several times. By the late 2010s, she was married to a man named Charles Vallow. JJ's adoptive family was living in Arizona. And then, gradually the people around Laurie began to notice that she was changing. She had become involved in a fringe world that existed at the outer edge of her religious community. A world of self-styled prophets, end-times preppers, podcasts and conferences devoted to the idea that the last days were imminent and that certain special individuals had been chosen to play a role in the events leading up to the second coming. It was in that world that Laurie met a man named Chad Daybell. Chad was an author. He ran a small publishing company in Idaho and had written a series of religious novels about apocalyptic prophecy, the end of the world, near-death experiences, and visions of the world beyond. He presented himself as a man with spiritual gifts, someone who could see things others could not, who could perceive the spiritual condition of the people around him. Chad was married to a woman named Tammy Daybell, with whom he had 5 children, and had built a quiet life in the small Idaho town of Salem. But Chad and Laurie were drawn together, and at the heart of their connection was a shared and escalating belief system that they built between the two, them, a private mythology that grew darker and more dangerous the deeper into it they went. Core of that belief system was an idea about light and dark. Chad and Laurie came to believe that they could rate human beings on a spiritual scale, and that some people were light and some were dark. They believed in the existence of zombies, which, in their private theology, did not mean the Walking Dead of the movies, but rather living people, whose original spirits had supposedly departed or been displaced, leaving the body taken over by a dark spirit. Person could be declared a zombie in their thinking. And once a person was a zombie, their physical body was merely a shell housing something evil. And they believed most fatefully that the way to free the trapped soul and deal with the dark spirit was for the body to die. They wrapped all of this in grand spiritual language. Laurie came to believe that she was a special, exalted being with a divine mission, that she had lived many times before, and that she had been chosen to help gather the righteous before the end of the world. Chad's visions, in their shared world, were the authority that confirmed all of it. The danger of this belief was that the people closest to them began, one by one, to be reclassified as dark, as zombies, as obstacles to the mission. And the people who received those labels began to die. First was Laurie's husband, Charles. In the summer of 2019, the marriage was collapsing. Charles had become alarmed at the changes in his wife, her talk of past lives and visions, and her insistence that she was a goddess, and he had sought to separate from her. In July of 2019, Laurie's home in suburban Phoenix, Charles was shot and killed. The man who shot him was Laurie's own brother, Alex Cox, who claimed it had been self-defense after an argument. At the time, the death was not treated as a murder. Alex Cox himself would die. A few months later, in December 2019, of natural causes, taking whatever he knew with him. But investigators would come to believe that the killing of Charles Vallow had been no act of self-defense at all, that it had been planned, that it cleared the way for Laurie in 2 ways at once. It removed the husband who was trying to pull her out of the spell she was under, positioned her to collect on his life insurance policy worth around $1 million. With Charles gone, path was open for Laurie and Chad to be together, except that Chad was still married to Tammy. And so Tammy became, in the logic of their belief system, the next obstacle. In October of 2019, Tammy Daybell died in her home in Idaho. At the time, death was attributed to natural causes, and she was buried without an autopsy. Just 2 weeks later, Chad Daybell and Laurie Vallow were married, beachside ceremony in Hawaii. a newly free man and a newly widowed woman beginning their new life together with astonishing speed. It was the suddenness of that marriage and the strangeness surrounding it that began to draw real scrutiny. Tammy's body was later exhumed, and a new examination concluded that she had not died naturally at all. She had been asphyxiated. But the question that gripped the country, the question that turned this from a regional case into a national obsession, was simpler and more terrible than the deaths of the adults. Where were the children? Tylee and JJ had vanished in September. Concerned relatives, in particular JJ's grandparents, had been desperately trying to confirm that the little boy was alive and well, and they could not. When police finally conducted a welfare check and began asking Laurie directly where her children were, she gave answers that made no sense, claimed JJ was staying with a family friend, and then, rather than cooperating, she and Chad left the state and went to Hawaii. Children were not with any friend. They were not anywhere they could be found. For months, 2 children were missing. Their mother was refusing to account for them. And the public watched, with growing dread, a case in which the most likely explanation was the one no one wanted to say out loud. That dread was confirmed in June of 2020, when investigators searched Chad Daybell's rural property in Salem, Idaho. In the ground there, they found the remains of both children. Tylee, the 16-year-old, had been dismembered and burned. JJ, the 7-year-old little boy with autism, had been buried wrapped in plastic, body-bound. The children had been dead since September, buried on the property of the man, their mother, had married weeks after her own husband's death, while she told the world they were fine. The investigation indicated that JJ had likely been suffocated and that both children had been killed in the days after they were last seen, their deaths fitting the timeline of the family's descent into the belief that the people around them had become dark. The trials that followed unfolded over years. Laurie Vallow Daybell was tried first in Idaho in the spring of 2023. Prosecutors laid out the doomsday belief system, the money motive, the pattern of deaths that conveniently removed every obstacle between Laurie and the life she wanted. In May of 2023, she was convicted of the first-degree murders of both of her children and of conspiracy in the death of Tammy Daybell. In July of 2023, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, 3 consecutive life sentences for the murders of Tylee, JJ, and Tammy. Chad Daybell was tried separately in Idaho the following year. In the spring of 2024, he was convicted on all counts, the murders of JJ, Tylee, and his wife Tammy, and in June of 2024, a jury sentenced him to death. He sits on Idaho's death row. For Laurie, the legal reckoning did not end in Idaho. She was extradited to Arizona to answer for the crimes that had taken place there. In 2 separate trials in Phoenix in 2025, representing herself in court, she was convicted of conspiring to murder her estranged husband, Charles Vallow, conspiring to murder another man. Brandon Boudreaux, the former husband of her niece, who had survived a shooting attempt in 2019, fired at him from a vehicle as he pulled up to his home that narrowly missed. Boudreaux had come to suspect. Laurie and her brother were behind Charles's death, and prosecutors argued he had been targeted to silence that suspicion. In July of 2025, an Arizona judge handed Laurie 2 more life sentences, to be served on top of the 5 she was already serving in Idaho. Courtroom. She did not express remorse. She spoke, instead, about what she called an unjust system, and at one point, asked about the people she had been convicted of killing, she suggested that her dead children were simply busy and happy somewhere else. Her surviving son, Colby, and other members of her own family sat in court and called her what the evidence had shown her to be. What makes the case of Laurie Vallow and Chad Daybell so distinct among the cases on this list is the size of the group at the centre of it. No compound, no membership of hundreds, no congregation. The entire cult, in the end, consisted essentially of two people, Pond, a man who wrote novels about the end of the world, and a woman who came to believe she was a goddess, reinforcing each other's delusions in a closed loop until those delusions had a body count. They did not need 1,000 followers, they only needed each other. And the belief they built together was enough to convince a mother that her own son and daughter, two children she had once doted on, had been hollowed out and replaced by dark spirits, and that their deaths were not murders, but a kind of spiritual housekeeping. That is the terrifying thing about this case. Shows that the machinery of a doomsday cult, the special mission, the chosen status, the reclassification of inconvenient human beings as evil, the reframing of killing as something holy, does not require a crowd. It can run on two people, and it can all reach down to a 7-year-old boy and a 16-year-old girl who trusted their mother completely right up until the end. Grandparents who fought for months to find JJ, and the family members who tried to pull Laurie back before any of it happened were left to bury two children and to carry the knowledge that the danger had come from inside the family itself, from the one person whose entire purpose was supposed to be keeping those children safe. Tylee Ryan was 16 years old. JJ Vallow was 7. They were last seen alive in September of 2019, and for months afterward, while they lay in the ground on a property in Idaho, their mother went on television, went to Hawaii, got married, and told anyone who asked that her children were perfectly fine. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Laurie Vallow built her doomsday world with one other person and let it consume her own children. The next case crosses the ocean to Chile, where another self-declared spiritual master convinced a small circle of educated professional followers that he was God in human form, where the same machinery of total belief ended with the burning of a baby they were told was the Antichrist. Case 9, Antares de la Luz. It was around the year 2010, in the city of Santiago, the capital of Chile, in the kind of small spiritual gathering that takes place in living rooms and rented rooms in every modern city in the world. A group of people, most of them educated, professional and outwardly successful, had begun meeting for sessions of meditation and what they called self-healing, led by a soft-spoken man in his early 30s who seemed to understand something about life that the rest of them were still searching for. The people in that circle were not the lost and the destitute. Among those who would eventually be drawn into the group were a filmmaker, veterinarian, a flight attendant, university graduates, people with careers and families and futures. They had come looking for peace, for meaning, for healing from things they carried inside them. They found a teacher who told them he could give them all of it. Within a few years, Quiet Meditation Circle would carry a newborn baby, only 2 or 3 days old, pit dug in the ground in a remote part of the Chilean countryside, and would do something there so far outside the bounds of what most people believe a human being is capable of that the entire country recoiled from it. The man who led them believed completely that he was God and that the baby was the Antichrist, and that the world was about to end. The man had been born Ramon Gustavo Castillo Gaite in Santiago, December of 1977. For most of his life, there was nothing about him that would have suggested where he would end up. He came from an ordinary middle-class family. He studied at a university focused on education, training to be a teacher. He was a gifted musician, particularly with wind instruments. the clarinet and the traditional Andean flutes. For several years, he played in an Andean fusion band called Amaru. He worked as a teacher at a school for vulnerable children, the kind of job a person takes because they want to do some good in the world. People who knew him in those years described an unremarkable, gentle young man. He had friends. He had a normal life. There was no early sign of the catastrophe that he would become the centre of. Something began to change in him after a trip he took abroad to China in the mid-2000s. The people around him noticed a shift when he came back. He grew more intense, more inward, more preoccupied with mystical and spiritual ideas. He began to suggest that there was something inside him, some presence or entity, something that set him apart from other people. He started to claim that he had the power to heal with his hands. The ordinary music teacher was receding, and in his place was emerging a figure he would eventually give a new name. He called himself Antares de la Luz, Antares of the Light, taking the name from Antares' brilliant red star at the heart of the constellation Scorpio. By around 2009 and 2010, he had begun gathering followers through his healing and meditation groups, and the transformation was nearly complete. Antares de la Luz told the people who gathered around him that he was not merely a teacher or a healer. He told them he was a divine being, the reincarnation of God, the second coming of Jesus Christ, returned to the earth in human form. The people who believed him did so for reasons that are worth understanding, because it is tempting to assume that only the foolish or the broken could fall for a claim that grand. That assumption is exactly what makes these stories so dangerous, because it is wrong. Many of the people Antares drew in were intelligent, capable, accomplished adults. What a number of them shared was not stupidity but pain, difficult childhoods, emotional wounds, a hunger for meaning that their successful outward lives had not satisfied. Antares offered them a framework that explained everything, a community that accepted them, and a leader who seemed to see straight into their souls and to know what they needed. He used the language of healing and enlightenment, and he used something else as well. The group incorporated ayahuasca, powerful hallucinogenic plant brew used for centuries in indigenous South American spiritual traditions, into its rituals. In the proper traditional context, ayahuasca is used with great care. In Antares' hands, the altered states it produced became another tool, another way to loosen his followers' grip on their own judgment, and to bind them more tightly to his version of reality. And his control became total. As the group consolidated and eventually based itself in a rural area called Coligüe in the Valparaiso region, the life of the followers came under Antares' complete domination. He controlled what they did, what they believed, how they related to one another. He subjected members to physical and psychological abuse, beatings and punishments that were reframed as purification, necessary suffering on the path to enlightenment. He claimed sexual access to the women in the group. He convinced his followers that he could see their spiritual condition, that he knew their past lives, that disobedience to him was disobedience to God. The members had given him their minds, and once a person has surrendered their mind, the leader's reality becomes the only reality they have left. They were not, by the end, capable of stepping outside his version of the world to ask whether any of it was true, because he had become the very ground they were standing on. At the center of Antares' teaching was a date. Like so many of the leaders on this list, he preached that the end of the world was near, and he attached it to a specific moment. The world, he said, would end on the 21st of December 2012. The date had become a global fixation because of an interpretation of the ancient Mayan calendar. All across the world that year posed Mayan apocalypse was a subject of documentaries and jokes and mild anxiety, something most people treated as entertainment. Inside the group at Coligüe, it was not entertainment. It was the literal end, approaching fast, and Antares was the divine figure, who alone understood what had to be done to meet it. Fracture that turned this group from an abusive cult into a sight of unspeakable horror came from a pregnancy. One of the members, a young woman named Natalia Guerra, who was in her mid-20s, became pregnant. The father was Antares himself. Here his delusion produced its most monstrous conclusion. Antares believed he was God in human form, and he reasoned that if he was God, then a child conceived from his human body could not be a holy child. In his theology, a divine being in mortal flesh could only produce its opposite. He became convinced that the baby Natalia was carrying was the Antichrist, the figure of ultimate evil, and that the birth of this child was connected to the coming end of the world. The arrival of the baby was interpreted, in the group's collective delusion, as a sign and as a threat that had to be removed. As the pregnancy advanced, Antares isolated Natalia from the rest of the world. She was confined to a house in an area called Los Andes, kept apart, cut off even from her own family, alone with the pregnancy and the belief that had been built around it. The baby was born in late November of 2012 in the coastal city of Viña del Mar, and in a detail that says everything about what was intended, the birth was deliberately kept off the books. The child was never registered with the civil authorities. On paper, in the official record of the country, this baby effectively never existed at all. That was not an oversight. It was preparation. What happened next took place on the night of the 23rd of November 2012. At the group's property in the countryside at Coligüe, the members had gathered. A pit had been prepared in the ground and a fire had been built. The baby was only 2 or 3 days old. Under Antares' direction, and with the participation of the mother and the other members in the grip of the shared delusion he had constructed, the newborn was carried to the fire as a sacrifice. An act, they had been told, was necessary to defeat the Antichrist and to stop the end of the world. The infant did not survive. It is one of the most disturbing crimes in the modern history of Latin America, and it is made worse, almost unbearable, by the fact that the people who carried it out were not, by any ordinary measure, monsters. They were a veterinarian, a flight attendant, a filmmaker, a young mother, ordinary educated people who had walked into a meditation circle a few years earlier, looking for peace, and who had been led, step by step, belief by belief, ayahuasca ritual by ayahuasca ritual, all the way to a bonfire in the dark and the death of a 2-day-old child they had been told was the embodiment of evil. And then the 21st of December 2012 arrived. The Mayan apocalypse did not come. The world was exactly where it had been. The terrible thing had been done on the strength of a prophecy, and the prophecy, for every doomsday prophecy on this list, simply failed. Antares, by some accounts, responded the way these leaders always respond when the date passes, by rescheduling the end of the world for a later year. But the spell could not hold forever after that. A group that has crossed the line into killing a newborn and then watched the predicted apocalypse fail to arrive is a group under unbearable internal pressure. Doubt began to spread, the structure began to crack, the case broke open. In April of 2013, when authorities received information about what had happened in Coligüe, one of Antares' closest followers had broken away from the group and would become central to exposing the crime and to the investigation. That followed, providing the detailed account of what had taken place. When the story reached the press, it detonated across Chile and far beyond. The idea that a cult had burned a newborn baby alive as a human sacrifice was so horrifying that it dominated headlines around the world. Nationwide manhunt began for Ramon Castillo Gaite, the man who called himself Antares de la Luz, and it quickly spread beyond Chile's borders into the neighbouring countries of Bolivia and Peru. Because by then he had fled, Antares never answered for what he did in any courtroom. He made his way to Peru, to the city of Cusco, high in the Andes, the ancient heart of the Inca world, and he hid there. But the net was closing, as the authorities of two countries hunted him, and he understood that capture was near. He ended his own life. On the 1st of May, 2013, Ramon Castillo Gaite was found dead in an abandoned dwelling in Cusco. He had hanged himself. He was 35 years old. The man who had convinced a circle of educated professionals that he was God, who had presided over the death of his own child, escaped every consequence that the justice of this world could have imposed on him. There would be no trial of Antares de la Luz, testimony forced out of him, no sentence, no accounting. He decided the terms of his own ending, just as he had decided everything else, and he took whatever full understanding of his crimes existed with him into the ground. That left the followers. Their fate raises one of the hardest questions any of these cases raises, which is how much responsibility a person bears for terrible things they did while under the total psychological domination of another human being. The members who remained were arrested and brought into the legal system. Courts had to weigh the genuine horror of what had been done against the reality that these people had been subjected to years of abuse, manipulation, and chemically assisted control by a man who had hollowed out their capacity for independent judgment. The disciple who had broken away became the central witness, the person whose account made the prosecution possible. The baby's mother, Natalia Guerra, did not face justice quickly. She evaded capture for years, remaining at large until she was finally arrested later in the decade, and she was ultimately imprisoned for her role before being released after serving her time. The sentences handed down in the case were, to many observers, strikingly light for a crime so grave, precisely because the courts treated the followers as people who had themselves been victims of Antares' domination, instruments of a delusion that originated entirely in one man's mind. Whether that was justice or a failure of justice is something people in Chile still argue about, because there is no satisfying answer to it. The one person whose guilt was beyond any question was already dead by his own hand, and everyone else was, in some measure, perpetrator and casualty of the same man. What the case of Antares de la Luz leaves behind is the smallest, and in some ways the most haunting, victim on this entire list. The baby who died at Coligüe lived for only 2 or 3 days. The child was never registered, never officially recorded as having been born at all, deliberately erased from the paperwork of the country in advance, so that the killing would leave no trace. A human being came into the world, existed for a handful of days, was taken out of it again by the very people who should have protected that life above all others, including the mother who carried the child, the father who declared the child evil. There was no monster who broke into the house. There was no stranger on a trail. Danger was the family the baby was born into, and the belief that family had been led to hold by a former music teacher who had decided he was God. It is worth sitting at the end with how this one began, because it is the warning that runs through every case in this collection, and it is at clearest here. It began with meditation. It began with healing. It began with a group of accomplished, intelligent, wounded people sitting in a circle, looking for peace and meaning, which is one of the most ordinary and human things a person can want. There was nothing foolish in that wanting. The man who exploited it understood. The way every leader on this list understood. People most open to being saved are also the people most able to be destroyed, and that the distance between the two is crossed not in a single leap but in 1,000 small steps, each one only slightly further than the last, until a circle of ordinary people is standing around a fire in the dark, doing the unthinkable, certain that they are doing something holy. Antares de la Luz did not need an army. He needed about a dozen searching human beings and a few years, and that was enough to lead them all the way to the worst thing a person can do. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Antares de la Luz needed only a dozen followers and a fire in the dark to take a single life. The next group shared that same total devotion, but its followers were chemists and doctors drawn from Japan's finest universities, and they turned their belief into a nerve gas they carried onto a crowded Tokyo train at the height of the morning rush. Case 10. Aum Shinrikyo. It was just after 8 o'clock on the morning of Monday, March 20, 1995, in the subway system beneath central Tokyo, in the dense network of tunnels running under the government district of Kasumigaseki, the heart of one of the largest and safest cities on Earth. It was the peak of the morning rush hour. The trains were packed, the way Tokyo trains are packed, with office workers in dark suits, civil servants on their way to the ministries, students, ordinary people pressed shoulder to shoulder, reading newspapers, half asleep, thinking about the day ahead. Japan in 1995 was a country with an almost unique sense of public safety, a place where violent crime was rare, and where a person could ride a crowded train at rush hour without a single thought for their security. Morning, on 5 different train cars across 3 subway lines, 5 men carried packages wrapped in newspaper. Inside the packages were plastic bags filled with a clear liquid. At a coordinated moment, each of the men set his package down on the floor of the train and punctured the bags with the sharpened tip of an umbrella and got off. Most. Within minutes, commuters all along those lines began to collapse. By the time the morning was over, 13 people would be dead. More than 6,000 would be injured, some of them permanently blinded or paralyzed, and the myth that anywhere in modern Japan was truly safe would be gone forever. The liquid in the bags was sarin, a nerve agent originally developed by the Nazis, and the men who released it were members of a religious movement that had begun a decade earlier, a small yoga and meditation group promising enlightenment. The group was called Aum Shinrikyo, which translates roughly to Supreme Truth, and its leader was a man named Shoko Asahara, born Chizuo Matsumoto in 1955. Asahara was partially blind from childhood, having limited sight in one eye and none in the other, and he had grown up navigating a world that treated him as different. As a young man, he studied acupuncture and traditional medicine, dabbled in various spiritual practices, and got into legal trouble for selling fake remedies. Then, in the 1980s, he reinvented himself as a spiritual master. He grew his hair and beard long, dressed in flowing robes, and began teaching yoga and meditation, presenting himself as a man who had achieved enlightenment and could lead others to it. He claimed he could levitate. He claimed he could read minds and see the future. He claimed eventually to be a divine figure, blending the language of Buddhism, Hinduism, Christian apocalypse into a single grand vision with himself at the center of it. The movement he built around these claims attracted a particular kind of follower, and it is the same detail that runs through so many of the cases on this list. Aum Shinrikyo did not draw in the ignorant or the desperate, drew in the educated. It was especially successful at recruiting bright, ambitious young people from Japan's top universities, students and graduates in medicine, in chemistry, in physics, in engineering. These were among the most capable young minds in the country, and they were also, many of them, profoundly disillusioned. Japan in the 1980s was a society of intense pressure, relentless work, material success, spiritual emptiness, and a generation of high-achieving young people found themselves asking what any of it was for. Asahara offered them an answer. He offered meaning, a sense of higher purpose, a spiritual hierarchy they could climb, and a master who told them they were special, that they were the chosen few who understood the truth that the sleeping masses around them could not see. They gave up their careers, their families, and their possessions to join him. They moved into the group's communal facilities, and, crucially, the scientists and engineers. Among them gave Asahara something almost no other cult leader in history ever possessed, which was the technical ability to turn his apocalyptic fantasies into real weapons. Because at the core of Aum Shinrikyo, beneath the meditation and the yoga and the talk of enlightenment, was the same engine that drove Jonestown and the Solar Temple and the movement in the hills of Uganda. It was the end of the world. Asahara preached that a final apocalyptic war, an Armageddon, was coming. He taught that the world was hopelessly corrupt. That catastrophe was inevitable, that only Aum Shinrikyo and its followers would survive to build the world thereafter. Over time, in Asahara's increasingly paranoid and grandiose mind, the prophecy curdled into something worse than waiting for the end. He began to believe that the group could and should help bring the apocalypse about, and that anyone who stood in its way, defectors, critics, investigators, ordinary citizens, were legitimate targets. The doctrine even provided a justification for killing, twisted spiritual concept, by which taking a life could supposedly spare the victim from accumulating worse karma, so that murder was reframed, exactly as it always is in these groups, as a form of mercy and a service to the universe. The group built its main headquarters in the foothills of Mount Fuji, and behind the facade of a religious commune, chemists and engineers of Aum Shinrikyo went to work. They constructed laboratories. They began producing chemical weapons. At their main facility, they built a plant that investigators would later determine was capable of manufacturing enough sarin to kill millions of people. They experimented with other nerve agents, with biological weapons, with anthrax, and they even sought to acquire the materials for far more catastrophic weapons. A religious movement that the wider world still thought of, if it thought of it at all, as a fringe group of yoga enthusiasts had quietly become one of the most dangerous non-state organizations on the planet. Almost no one outside it understood what was happening. The violence began before the subway. As early as 1989, when a lawyer named Tsutsu Sumi Sakamoto was building a legal case against the group on behalf of worried families, members went to his home in the night and killed him, along with his wife and their infant son, and hid the bodies. The family simply vanished. For years the case went unsolved. Then, in June of 1994, in the city of Matsumoto, the group carried out a trial run of its chemical weapons, releasing sarin in a residential neighborhood in an attempt to kill judges who were hearing a case against Aum. 8 people died and hundreds were injured. Astonishingly, even after that, the connection to the cult was not immediately understood, and an innocent local resident was wrongly suspected for a time. The group had killed, repeatedly, and had still not been stopped. That impunity emboldened Asahara further. By early 1995, Asahara had become convinced that the authorities were finally closing in. A police raid on the group was imminent. And he decided to strike first, on a scale that would throw the entire country into chaos. Plan was the attack on the Tokyo subway, timed and placed to flood the trains passing through the government district with nerve gas. During the busiest part of the morning, the men chosen to carry it out were not street criminals. One of them was a medical doctor. They were educated members of the group who had risen in its ranks, and they carried out the order because Asahara, whom they regarded as a divine master, had given it. They boarded the trains with their wrapped packages, set them down among the morning commuters, punctured them, and walked away, leaving the siren to spread through the closed, crowded cars. Followed was a scene of mass casualty in the heart of a peaceful city. Commuters began to choke, to lose their sight, to convulse and collapse. Poison spread through the train cars and out onto the platforms as the doors opened at each station. Stations filled with people in business suits lying on the ground or staggering, struggling to breathe. Emergency responders, not knowing at first what they were dealing with, rushed in without protection and were themselves overcome. 13 people lost their lives that morning. More than 6,000 were injured, and many of the survivors would carry the damage for the rest of their lives. Lingering vision problems, respiratory damage, deep psychological trauma. Among the dead was a subway worker who died after removing one of the punctured packages of sarin from a train. A man whose widow would go on to spend years as a leading voice for the victims of the attack, insisting that the world not look away from what had been done. This time, the group could not escape into the fog of unsolved mystery. The scale of the attack, in the center of the capital, mobilized the full force of the Japanese state. Investigators quickly linked the sarin to Aum Shinrikyo, and a massive raid was launched on the group's facilities at the foot of Mount Fuji. Police, again wearing protective gear, discovered the chemical weapons plant and the stockpiles of materials. The members were rounded up. Asahara himself was found some weeks later, hiding in a concealed space within one of the group's own buildings, and was arrested. The man who had claimed he could levitate and read minds and survive the end of the world was led away in handcuffs. The legal reckoning that followed was one of the longest in modern Japanese history. Trials of Asahara and the many members involved in the subway attack, and the group's other crimes stretched on for years, and then more than a decade. Asahara's own trial lasted around 8 years. He never offered a coherent explanation for what he had done. He pleaded not guilty. The course of the proceedings, he largely refused to engage, muttering, making incoherent statements, behaving in ways that some believed were a genuine deterioration, and others believed were a performance. Never gave the victims or the country the one thing they most wanted, which was an answer to the question of why. In 2004, he was sentenced to death, and the sentence was upheld in 2006. 12 other members of the group were also sentenced to death for their roles in the subway attack and the cult's other killings. In total, across the subway attack and the rest of its crimes, Shinrikyo had killed 27 people. For years, the condemned members sat on death row, while the remaining trials of co-conspirators slowly concluded. Because, under the system, the executions were held until all the related cases were finished. Finally, in 2018, after the last of those legal proceedings ended, the Japanese government carried out the sentences. On the morning of July 6, 2018, Shoko Asahara was hanged, along with 6 other members of the group. Later that same month, on July 26, the remaining 6 were executed as well. All 13 members of Aum Shinrikyo who had been sentenced to death were put to death within a span of weeks, 23 years after the sarin spread through the Tokyo subway. For the families of the victims, the executions brought a complicated mixture of relief and emptiness, because the man at the centre of it had gone to the gallows without ever explaining himself, and because no execution could undo the morning of March 20, 1995, or restore the years and the health that the survivors had lost. The group itself did not entirely disappear. It splintered and renamed itself, continuing to exist in a diminished form under close government surveillance, watched carefully for any sign that it might ever again become what it had been. And the deeper questions the case raised never fully went away. Whom Shinrikyo had terrified the world for a reason that went beyond the horror of the attack itself. It had demonstrated that a doomsday cult, given enough educated and devoted followers, could acquire and use weapons capable of mass slaughter, that the apocalyptic fantasy of a single deluded leader could be married to real chemistry and real engineering and turned loose on a civilian population. Governments around the world studied the case and recognized, for the first time with real clarity, that the threat of weapons of mass destruction did not come only from nations and armies, but could come from a religious movement operating out of a compound at the foot of a mountain, staffed by some of the brightest graduates of a country's finest universities. That is the detail that lingers, and it is the same one that has run through all 10 of these cases in one form or another. People who built Asahara's chemical weapons were not failures or fools. They were doctors and physicists and chemists, people who had spent years training their minds to the highest level their society could offer, and they used those trained minds to manufacture nerve gas for a half-blind man who told them he was a god, and that the world was about to end. They did it because he had given them what every leader on this list gave their followers: a sense that they were special. They understood a truth the rest of the world was too asleep to see, and that their obedience was not weakness but enlightenment. The intelligence of those young scientists did not protect them from him. In a terrible way, it made them more useful to him, because his fantasy needed their competence to become a weapon. They had gone looking, like so many of the people in these stories, for meaning in a life that felt empty, and they had found a man who turned that search into a plant capable of producing enough poison to kill millions, and then sent 5 of their own onto morning trains full of strangers. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.